Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, episode 36, What About Livingston? Last time, we looked at two periods of factionalism in colonial New York, the merchant landowner rivalry of the 1710s and 20s, and the Morris-Cosby dispute of the 1730s. During these decades, the various elite factions within the colony were slowly learning how to appeal to popular opinion as a weapon in their fights against each other. Today we're going to talk about the final few decades of New York's colonial history, from the 1740s to the 1760s. Once again, there will be two separate rounds of factionalism. The first will be like the Morris-Cosby dispute, a battle between elites which goes public. The second round will be a confusing whirlpool of different interest groups aligning and de-aligning with each other as New York goes through increasingly rapid changes in the run-up to the American Revolution. But first, a few words on how New York has changed over the last several decades, just to put things in perspective. The population had grown from 19,000 in 1700 to 80,000 in 1750, though plenty of other colonies were still bigger. The Dutch domination of Albany was declining sharply, thanks in part to the large influx of men to fight in the wars with Quebec. According to the historian Michael Kamen, quote, "One measurable result was that the proportion of voters with Dutch surnames in Albany County declined from 82% in 1720 to 57% in 1763. So the old Dutch-English split was still there, but becoming less important with each passing decade. Literacy was growing and the colony was becoming more cultured. The first college in New York, which would become Columbia University, was chartered in 1754, a full 118 years after Harvard in Massachusetts. Print culture was starting to develop as well. The first public library was opened in 1754 and an increasing number of books were published within the colony. And 22 different newspapers were printed in New York during the colonial era, almost all in New York City. These were mostly weekly newspapers with just a few pages per edition, but they were widely read. And the press paid an increasing amount of attention to politics as time went on. According to Kamen, during the 1750 election, there were 40 political titles published. During the 1761 election, 59 titles. And in 1769, 135 titles. So just like how New York was becoming less Puritan over time, I think that New York was becoming less mercantile. It was still very focused on trade, but the other aspects of civilization were being brought in as well. So that's New York in general, but let's get into the narrative for this episode. To begin with, I need to introduce the leader of one of the two factions that are about to form, James Delancey. Delancey, born in 1703, was the son of Stephen Delancey, founder of one of the leading merchant families in New York. As a young man, he studied law in England and came back to America to work as a lawyer. Thanks to his family's connections, he was made a member of the council at age 26 and a member of the Supreme Court soon afterwards. Now, you'll remember from last episode that Governor Cosby got into a fight with Lewis Morris, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he had Morris removed from the court altogether. Well, that was good news for Delancey. When Morris was fired, Delancey was promoted to be Chief Justice at age just 30, an office he'd hold for the next 27 years. So Delancey was already in a great position for such a young man. But he wasn't content to merely hold one of the most powerful posts in the colony. He was also determined to build up a network of supporters, and with the help of his family, he did just that. The Delanceys became one of the most powerful families in the colony, and his father and two of his brothers all served as assemblymen at various periods. A bit like Thomas Hutchinson in Massachusetts, I suppose. And on top of that, Delancey was also very well connected in London. He and his sister had both married into very prominent English families, plus he had economic and personal ties with other important Englishmen. In fact, Delancey was so well positioned that he was often thought to be more powerful than the governors were. But although he was accumulating all this power, he wasn't using it to oppose the government. Instead, the best path for him was to support the governors, since that was the way to get even more power. So when a new governor, George Clinton, arrived in 1743, he received a warm welcome from Delancey, who promised to use his network of supporters to back Clinton. In return, Clinton appointed several of Delancey's friends to the council, which increased his influence even further. Delancey became Clinton's chief advisor. Governor Clinton, by the way, had served as an officer in the Navy for the last 35 years, and he'd also been governor of Newfoundland for a time. But although Delancey and Clinton started off as close allies, within just a few years the two had a serious falling out, probably thanks to the start of King George's War. Now, no one in New York was looking forward to another war, especially considering how the last wars had been ruinously expensive disasters. So none of the New Yorkers were looking to prosecute the war with any vigor. They wanted minimal involvement. Governor Clinton, on the other hand, since he represented British interests, was duty-bound to push the fight as hard as he could, to goad the colonists into supporting the war even against their will. But almost none of the local politicians wanted to back him on this, including Delancey. They were all hemming and hawing, hoping to avoid publicly supporting an unwanted war. And so, after Delancey declined to attend an important conference with the Iroquois about the war effort, Clinton replaced him as chief advisor with another man who might actually help him fight the war. That other man was named Cadwallader Colden. Colden had been born in Scotland and he studied medicine there before setting off for America. In America, he did well for himself, becoming a scientist of some note and corresponding with the likes of Benjamin Franklin and Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy. Like many scientists back then, he was also active in political life. In fact, Franklin had encouraged him to remain active in politics, and not just retreat to his study to conduct his research in private. But he had a reputation as rigid and pugnacious, and he'd managed to offend many prominent men in the colony. Normally that might be a problem, but I suppose in this case it was an advantage, since Colden didn't have much to lose by helping the governor do unpopular things. He was already used to picking fights, so this was no different. But the point is, Delancey was out and Colden was in. However, no matter which advisors he had, Governor Clinton's popularity was bound to decrease. So an opposition began to form, and naturally James Delancey stepped in as leader. It was an obvious choice for him. Of course you should oppose the governor who had spurned you and who was now leading an unpopular and unsuccessful war effort. It was all upside. Delancey took his network of supporters and used them to assemble a broader coalition of different groups opposed to the war. Albany merchants, farmers worried about economic disruption, and so on. But actually King George's War ended in just a few years when the factionalism was only getting started. So at first Governor Clinton wasn't too worried. He figured that with the end of the war he could easily win the colony back to his side. He started by removing supporters of Delancey from the upper house and replacing them with his own men. That was simple enough, but the lower house was a harder nut to crack. The assembly was thoroughly controlled by Delancey's faction. In order to govern effectively, he was going to have to fight for control of the assembly, and that meant appealing to the people. It was an uphill task. Delancey had much deeper roots in the colony than he did. But Clinton set his advisor Colden to work, replacing many of the appointed officials throughout the colony with his own men, that he might have better control over the election process. By 1750 he was ready to call for a new election. Both sides fought hard, going after each other in the newspapers. Delancey himself went out into the countryside to encourage supporters to vote. Well, according to Governor Clinton's faction, Delancey wasn't just out in the country to shake hands and be nice, he was there to browbeat people into voting for him. Supposedly, Delancey even threatened to forcibly enlist men in the army if they didn't support him. In fact, Clinton's faction made numerous accusations like that, saying that the Delanceys were threatening and bribing voters, as well as shipping in people from outside to cast votes in elections they weren't supposed to vote in. Whether or not these accusations are true is hard to say. A lot of the evidence we have comes from unreliable partisan sources. But there were a lot of accusations like this being thrown around, and I have to imagine that at least some of them were true. In any case, whether through fraud or genuine support or both, Delancey's faction won the election handily. Governor Clinton was so depressed by the results that he wrote to London, asking that either he or Delancey be removed from office, as, quote, "It is impossible that I can maintain His Majesty's prerogative in opposition to the influence and crafty wiles of him at the head of the faction," end quote. However, Clinton wasn't recalled from office yet, and so that next year he decided to try again. He dissolved the assembly and once again called for elections. But once again he and his men were thoroughly defeated. However, fortunately I guess, in the spring of that next year, 1753, Clinton was relieved of his office. Officials in London had decided that the only way to fix the colony's problems was with a fresh start. Finally, his tribulations were over, so goodbye, Governor Clinton. A new governor was sent to New York to fix things, but as it turned out, the new guy was very depressed over his wife's recent death, and he hung himself just a few days after he arrived in the colony. With the new governor's suicide, Delancey, who had recently been appointed lieutenant governor, now became acting governor, a position he'd hold for most of the rest of the decade. The opposition was now the government. Now that he was in command, Delancey took steps to lower tensions within the colony. He reached out to his rival Cadwallader Colden, and the two were easily reconciled. Pretty soon all the old rifts were healed, which just goes to show that the divisions had never been all that big to begin with. There were some real issues at stake, in particular the war effort, but mostly this was just a personal rivalry which ended as soon as one of the leaders involved had left the colony. Anyway, Delancey ruled New York for the rest of the decade as powerful a figure as the colony had ever known. But in 1760 he died unexpectedly of a heart attack at age 57. The loss of such a powerful figure put New York in a state of what you might call uneasy calm. No one knew what politics would be like in a post-Delancey world. With Delancey gone, Colden now became the acting governor. As I've already said, Colden was a pretty off-putting figure to a lot of New Yorkers, and that didn't change now that he was in charge. Simply put, he lacked tact and restraint. In particular, Colden made several attacks on the independence of the judiciary. He raised the possibility of giving the king greater control over judges, and he undermined the authority of juries to decide cases on their own. These actions alienated him from the lawyers of New York City, who were becoming an influential group by this point. But perhaps most importantly, he was a strong defender of the royal prerogative. When the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, it was just as unpopular in New York as in New England, but Colden felt compelled to enforce it anyway, which alienated everyone else in the colony. Soon New Yorkers were burning Colden in effigy. Only 5 years after Delancey's death, they were back at it again, fighting over politics. So that brings us to the next phase of factionalism in New York. Well, the last phase of factionalism before the Revolution. It's a confusing period, and I'm not even sure that the people at the time were entirely sure what they were fighting over, but I'll do my best to make it simple. First, we need to describe some of the most important groups within New York at this time. To begin with, the Livingston family. I've mentioned them a few times before, but only in passing. The Livingstons are one of the biggest landowning families in the Hudson Valley. As a result, many members of the family were politically active within the colony, although never quite important enough for me to mention by name. Well, that was starting to change. Back in the elections of 1758, just before Delancey had died, a full 4 members of the Livingston family were elected to the Assembly. They didn't yet form a coherent faction or anything, in fact they often voted against each other. But over time they were starting to come together. The Delancey family were merchants, and under Delancey's rule the merchants within the colony had been ascendant. Well, now the landlords were regaining their political footing, forming a faction of their own with the Livingstons in charge. Some of the most prominent lawyers in New York City sided with this faction as well, because they were opposed to Colden for the reasons I already mentioned. Plus, one of those prominent lawyers was himself a Livingston, so there was a family connection as well. And while this elite opposition was growing, popular opposition was rising as well, thanks to anger over the Stamp Act. The unhappy colonists formed a group called the Sons of Liberty to fight back. The Sons of Liberty soon spread throughout the 13 colonies. Within New York, the elite faction of Livingstons and lawyers decided to ally themselves with the movement. They hoped to harness the unrest for their own benefit, by taking over leadership for themselves. But their attempt didn't quite go according to plan. The passions of the people overtook them. Within just a few months, the Sons of Liberty had split into 2 groups, the moderates and the radicals. The Livingston faction sided with the moderates, but they were left controlling only half of a protest movement. And unfortunately for them, a new figure used that opening to jump into politics himself, James Delancey Jr., the son of the late James Delancey. Delancey Jr. had served as a captain in the British infantry during the French and Indian War, but after his father's death he returned to New York City to manage his family's affairs. Now he wanted to become a politician just like Dad. He made his entry into the political arena by siding with the radical faction of the Sons of Liberty. This was a very opportunistic move on his part. As we'll soon see, Delancey had no real commitment to radicalism. But in any case, the battle lines were being drawn, Delancey Jr. backing the radicals and the Livingston/landowner/lawyer faction backing the moderates. You'll note that there was no faction in favor of Colden in the Stamp Act. Colden was so unpopular that he hardly had any support at all. So these 2 factions are the important ones. It's hard to concisely state what these 2 groups were all about. After all, both factions were in large part alliances of convenience between popular movements and small elite factions, looking to capitalize on those movements for their own reasons. You had 2 elite groups and 2 popular groups, and which elite group sided with which popular group was more or less just coincidence. If history had gone slightly differently, it could have been reversed. There was no ideology holding them together. For convenience's sake, I'm going to call them the radicals and the moderates, but again, there's a lot more to it than that, and not all of the radicals were really that radical. But actually the Stamp Act was quickly repealed and a new governor came in to replace Colden, so the issues which had caused this factionalism had gone away, at least temporarily. However, the factionalism remained. As we've seen before, partisanship can continue on long after the root causes have faded into memory. It doesn't have to continue, but it can. And within a few years it was time for new elections, since they now had to be held at least once every 7 years. The new governor would have preferred not to dissolve the current assembly, but his hands were tied. And so both sides geared up for battle. I've already described how New York elections worked in general, so let me focus in on one election in particular, the election in New York City, so we can explore some of the details. Now, New York City sent 4 delegates to the Assembly, but instead of holding 4 separate elections, there was one big election all the candidates ran in. The top 4 vote-getters would become delegates. In this particular election, there were 7 candidates running. 2 of the candidates had no real shot at winning, so we can ignore them, which leaves 5 real candidates to discuss. The 2 leading men were Philip Livingston, a moderate, and James Delancey Jr. himself, supposedly a radical. Of the other 3 candidates, one was a moderate lawyer, while the other 2 were radical merchants allied with Delancey. This was a complex election which required some serious strategizing if he wanted to win. The radical faction decided to let Livingston win a seat without challenging him. He was already popular, and so he was likely to win no matter what they did. That way they could focus all their attention on the moderate lawyer. If they could attack him successfully, then Delancey and his 2 allies would all win seats in the Assembly, thus coming out ahead 3-1. So they went after the lawyer as hard as they could. In pamphlets and in newspaper articles, they argued that he was unfit to represent New York City. Firstly, he was a lawyer rather than a merchant, and New York City, being a commercial town, ought to be represented by merchants. Secondly, as a lawyer, he had ties to landowner families who opposed the interests of New York City. In fact, he'd represented some of them in court in their lawsuits against poor families. Thirdly, it was a bad idea to elect lawyers in general. Quote, "It would be more gross and dangerous to choose lawyers than other men, in proportion as they have more cunning, ability, and temptation to injure us than other men have. The more eminent their abilities are, the more ought we to dread and avoid them, for we may be assured that all those abilities will be exerted against us, if our folly should give them an opportunity." End quote. By the way, you may be interested to know that these days over a third of members of Congress are lawyers, although the numbers have been dropping for a while. Anyway, the moderates tried to push back against these attacks, but they were always on the defensive. Soon enough, the polls opened and voting began. In fact, the polls were open for 5 days straight, giving New Yorkers plenty of time to vote. During that time, both sides were busy trying to woo voters as best they could. In fact, campaigns like this were becoming pretty expensive, given the need to entice voters with food and alcohol. According to the historian Patricia Bonamy, at one tavern alone Delancey had to pay for, quote, 248 meals of victuals, 134 bottles of wine, 106.5 double bowls of punch, 117 mugs of beer and cider, and a variety of other beverages. End quote. The moderate lawyer also went around town scrounging up votes, though in a less grandiose fashion. Instead of buying food, he offered to bribe voters directly, supposedly even offering to buy someone a canoe in exchange for his vote. He also threatened to sue someone if he didn't vote for him. Or at least he was accused of doing these things. As always, it's hard to know for sure. In any case, the clever strategizing by Delancey and the radicals paid off. Livingston won a seat as expected, but they won the other 3 seats by a very comfortable margin of a few hundred votes out of around 6,000 cast. Outside of New York City, the radicals weren't quite as successful, though they did reasonably well. Roughly speaking, a third of the winners were moderates, a third were radicals, and a third were unaffiliated with either side, and might support one group or the other depending on the situation. However, this assembly lasted less than a year. Already there were new problems with Britain flaring up. Parliament had just passed another set of hated laws aimed at America, the Townshend Acts, and once again the colonists were in an uproar. When the Assembly began to challenge the Townshend Acts, the governor quickly dissolved the Assembly and called for new elections. The Stamp Act may have been repealed, but none of the problems with Britain had been solved at all. So that brings us to 1769, just 7 years before the Declaration of Independence. Once again, the factions were gearing up for the next election. The moderates, seeing how well the radicals had done with their simple arguments, lawyers bad, Stamp Act bad, decided to come up with a simple argument of their own. They decided to use religion as their issue. Let me briefly talk about religion in New York. The relationship between church and state in New York had always been complicated. Officials in London wanted the government to promote the Anglican Church, but Anglicans were always a minority within the colony, so in practice compromises had to be made with the Dutch, with the Puritans, and so on. In 1693, the Anglican Church had been sort of established as the official state religion, but only in a limited way. For the most part, toleration was the order of the day. There was some discrimination. Anglicans were always privileged, but not that much discrimination. Now, as it happened right around this time, there was some discussion of sending an Anglican bishop to America for the first time. America had never had a bishop of its own, just priests, and many dissenting Christians were happy to keep it that way. They feared that a bishop would increase the Church of England's control over them, that it might lead to greater intolerance over time. And so the moderates thought that this might be a good issue to latch onto. They hadn't challenged the Stamp Act enough for voters, but maybe they could challenge the idea of an American bishop, and link the radicals with the evils of Anglican control. As it happens, the Delancey family were prominent Anglicans, so there was at least some surface plausibility to the accusations. If it worked, the moderates would suddenly seem like the real opponents of English oppression, not the radicals. Sadly for them, though, it didn't work. I think that it was just too much of a stretch, too obviously opportunistic. It sounds like all they did was alienate Anglicans without attracting enough dissenters. The real issue was still the colony's relationship with the British government, and on that count the radicals were bound to be much more successful than the moderates. Let me go over the next election in New York City to compare it with the previous one. After the moderates only managed to win one of the 4 seats in the previous election, this time they proposed to compromise with the radicals. Instead of campaigning, why not agree to each nominate only 2 candidates? Wouldn't that be much easier for everyone? But of course, to the radicals that compromise meant losing a seat, so they refused. Instead, they made a counteroffer where they would nominate 3 candidates and the moderates would only nominate 1, which would leave things the way they were. However, the moderates refused that offer, and so once again both sides had to fight it out. By this time, caucuses were commonly held by various factions to nominate candidates for upcoming elections, but typically this was done behind the scenes, in those proverbial smoke-filled rooms. But this time, both factions decided that it would be in their interests to include the public in the nominating process. Hopefully that would increase their support when the election came. So the moderates held a large gathering of several hundred people in one of the fields around the city, while the radicals met indoors. Both sides nominated 4 candidates. But this time the radicals did even better. They won all 4 seats by a comfortable margin, and they improved their performance outside of the city as well, winning a solid majority of seats. Anti-British agitation was becoming very popular very quickly, and the radicals used their power to strengthen their control even more, by having several of the Livingstons expelled from the Assembly. They passed a law which excluded members of the Supreme Court from sitting in the Assembly, which got rid of one Livingston. They then kicked out another Livingston because he wasn't a resident of the district he was elected from. They also expelled Lewis Morris III, grandson of the Lewis Morris we talked about last time. By kicking all these enemies out, the radicals gained a much more absolute control over the Assembly. However, the so-called radicals in the Assembly were also rapidly becoming less and less radical. It wasn't really the radicals who had won, it was the Delancey part of the radical coalition. And now that they controlled the Assembly, they were detaching themselves from the real radicals. So although the election had been won on the grounds of fighting British tyranny, the Assembly soon began governing in exactly the opposite way. Naturally, everyone felt betrayed. The real radicals became even more radical. As a matter of fact, by the time the Revolution came around in just a few years, the Delanceys and the Livingstons had basically swapped places. The Delancey faction became conservative loyalists who rejected independence, while the Livingstons were more on the side of the radicals, although they weren't really radicals themselves. Not only that, James Delancey Jr. himself wound up in exile in Britain, just like Thomas Hutchinson. So you can see why I said that his alliance with the radicals was purely opportunistic. He betrayed them at the first opportunity, as soon as they seemed to be more of a liability than an asset. Hopefully you can now understand why John Adams called New York politics, quote, the devil's own incomprehensibles. Ideologies, family loyalties, class interests, regional interests were all mixed together in one big political stew, and you never knew what the next bite would taste like. I think that I'll end the story here. The political landscape was still shifting, but we're already almost to the revolution itself. I'll leave New York in a state of flux for now. This whole confusing sweep of ever-shifting factions would only be ended thanks to the question of independence, which clarified things in a way that nothing else could. New York will be the last colony to declare for independence, but it'll get swept up in the war just as much as everyone else. So that brings us to the end of New York's colonial history. A lot has happened, so let me give a quick recap. In the 1690s and 1700s, you had the feud between the Leislerians and anti-Leislerians. In the 1710s and 20s, you had the feud between the merchants and the big landowners. Then in the 1730s through the 1750s, you had several different instances of factionalism, all of which centered around local leaders enlisting local support in their fight against the governors. Court versus country, basically. And finally, in the 1760s, you had a much more confused round of factionalism, as I just described. And those are just the biggest examples of factionalism. There were plenty of smaller instances as well, which I didn't have a chance to discuss. But apart from what happened in New York, I'd also like to draw your attention to something equally important. What didn't happen. There was a lot of factionalism in New York, but there were just as many issues that New Yorkers could have fought over, but didn't. I mean, many of the problems which confounded politics in New England barely left a ripple in New York. For example, although in the early 1700s New York had had a big problem with its debt and with its paper money system, unlike in New England, New York managed it much more successfully. There were difficulties in the 1710s, but by the 1720s the government had a handle on things. There was much less inflation, and there weren't those big swings in the value of money that you saw in Massachusetts. Another big difference was the Great Awakening. In New England, with its close union of church and state, the Great Awakening was a super big deal. But in New York it passed almost without notice, at least outside of the Puritans of Long Island. New Yorkers were just not a very religious people. I haven't talked about Pennsylvania yet, but things were different there too. In Pennsylvania, many of the divisions were over ethnicity and religion, as new groups of immigrants came in and began taking over from the Quakers, who had become a small minority within their own colony. Obviously, nothing like that applied to New York. The point is this: in all of these colonies, at least in the North since the South was a bit different, in all of these colonies the issues being fought over were very different, but the overall political developments were similar. Factions became more organized over time, and they started to appeal directly to the people, even if they weren't yet real parties. The colonial legislatures became more assertive and powerful. Despite their different cultures and histories, they were all on the same track. Something to keep in mind as we approach the Revolution. Often it can seem like these colonies were in their own separate worlds, with nothing in common but the English language, but in fact they were converging politically in many ways, which no doubt helped them to cooperate when the time came. This was often, but not always, more of a top-down process. In the beginning, every colony had this network of elites in which disputes were supposed to be resolved internally within the elites themselves. But sooner or later, one group of elites realized that they could gain an advantage by appealing to the people. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, which had elected governors and elected upper houses, popular support was all you needed in order to take power. If the governor was appointed, things were a bit more complicated. Popular support helped, but it was insufficient. If all you controlled was the assembly, then the most you could do on your own was block legislation. Then maybe the governor would negotiate with you. But if you refused, then you could keep on blocking all of his legislation. That would make him look weak and incompetent to officials in London. Then you might convince the Board of Trade to have the governor removed from office and replaced with someone more to your liking. So in a colony like New York, you didn't want to win popular support for its own sake. It was really a way to send a message to London. This governor sucks and we refuse to work with him. The will of the people thus only had an indirect effect. But either way, there was still an advantage in appealing to the people. Whoever did so successfully had an edge over everyone else. And that meant that politics in every colony became more democratic, more populist over time. In order to appeal to the people, you actually had to offer them something. Sometimes, like with James Delancey Jr. supporting the Radicals, that something was offered cynically and in bad faith. Other times the offer was more sincere. But again, either way, the changes produced were similar. Once candidates were regularly appealing to you for your vote, it naturally seemed to you like you had the power, not them. The elites had invited the people in for their own short-term benefit, but the people had no intention of leaving. What had begun as a top-down process became more bottom-up over time. And then elected officials had to change their mindsets to match the new reality as well. They could compete for popular support or risk losing office or even being attacked by a mob. But I don't want to imply that if the elites in each colony had never sought popular support, then this could have been avoided. I'm certain that sooner or later the people would have realized their power and started to organize on their own behalf. After all, the New Lights in Connecticut were bottom-up from the very beginning, so it certainly was a possible alternative. If you have a broad franchise and if elected officials have real power, then sooner or later someone will try to appeal to the voters in order to wield that power. It might be top-down, it might be bottom-up, but sooner or later it'll happen. These divisions within the elite accelerated the process, I think, but they weren't essential. But still, that's how it happened, and I think that that's the best way to understand events in New York. All of that factionalism may seem like random noise, but if you take the long view, it really was building towards something: populist democracy. Next episode, we'll skip over New Jersey and jump straight to Pennsylvania to see how William Penn and his fellow Quakers are faring in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, and to see how they slowly lose power after being swamped by new waves of not-so-pacifist immigrants. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. The podcast is on Twitter @EarlyOftenPod, or go to the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com for transcripts of every single episode. And if you like the podcast, give it a good review on iTunes. That helps. Thanks for listening.